Welcome to the studio at Moggahanger Park. We are here to tell the story of our shared Christian heritage and explore all the challenges that we face today and in the future. I'm joined by Danny Stupple, who's the chair of Harvest Vision. He's part of the furniture at Moggahanger Park and very active in the Eastleigh area. Welcome, Danny.
Thank you.
And also Peter Smith, who is the chair of the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children, Evangelicals and Other Things. Welcome, Peter. It's great. And so we've got two chairs here and I'm sitting on the third. And in other words, I say that I'm joined by, but actually I'm joining Danny and Peter for a discussion, which we'll just see how it leads.
Yeah.
Danny, give us an overview of why you feel it's important that we sit here together with Peter.
Yeah, I think something that we're learning about the possibility that Moggahanger Park offers is by connecting its history, where the Thornton family welcomed the access that was given to the Clapham sect, the Clapham group. Obviously the friendship between the Thorntons, Henry and Stephen, with William Wilberforce is of specific meaning, I guess, to a lot of people. We're just fascinated by the family that lived here, that had the values, if you like, that were inculcated in the movement, but they were rooted in a family. So I thought, when we had access to have a chance to talk to Peter, that some of the bigger issues you never get a chance to talk about, that sit like a backcloth, really, to some of the detailed issues that people want to engage with, we could do that together. Yeah. So the one that's on my mind in talking to Peter today and in the past when we've met, I can still remember the first time I met him 10 years ago, and how he spoke about the issues. He has access to the UK situation quite deeply, obviously, but also the UN on the whole issue of pro-life. Yeah. And therefore is able to help us, yes, with the abortion issue specifically, but the wider backcloth of what's actually happening, I think, both UK and internationally. So I was going to ask a few questions along those lines.
Brilliant.
If I may.
And just in context now, about 3 or 4 years ago here at Moggahanger Park, we had a forum called Wilberforce Yesterday and Today.
Indeed. And
from that, a discussion with academics and Christian leaders, we highlighted 4 issues of importance that we thought we should focus on. Indeed. The top of the list was protecting the unborn. Over to you, Danny, for the other 3.
Yes, I mean, we understood in trying to look at what happened 200 years ago, there was no doubt, even the guys that were against them at the time and called them the sort of saints in Parliament couldn't say that they didn't change the country. And that's what fascinated us, is that 22 people, as far as we can tell, so worked together and so were able to catalyse a movement that led to a massive change from late Georgian society, which was in a terrible state, as the Industrial Revolution was not well managed, you could say. But by mid-Victorian to late Victorian time, you could see that what had been established in the generation that led into that was powerfully influenced by these people. So we noticed 3 other things. The first one, which surprised me, I always love a scholar who goes and surprises you, and Professor Wolf did just that. He said, you know, what Wilberforce did, he loved animals. And no one loved animals really in those days. So for evangelicals, who were perceived as judgmentalist, if you like, a toxic brand, were reimagined in the public mindset when he started caring for animals. And that not many people know that he formed the RSPCA. And so that fascinated me, that they were aware of how they were perceived, and he wasn't just doing it to be different. He did love animals, and I think there's something about the environment then. So the environment was important, and we want to engage with that as we're going to later in this conversation. But there was this freedom of conscience. Freedom, yes, of slavery, there's an obvious connection there. But in our day, we felt that there was a parallel. And Professor Wolf helped us again understand that freedom of conscience...
And this is Professor John Wolf of the Open University.
Indeed. Yeah. And he said, you know, that is a key issue, the freedom of thought, the freedom of conscience.
And then the 4th one was...
Yeah, this is where the conversation ended up with issues of justice and how you support those who find themselves the wrong side of the lines that people are defining now, and allowing people to have a fair voice, even if you disagree with them. So it's linked together, so freedom and justice. So they're the 4 points that you'll see on the CCM website, and yeah, that's where we got to.
And we were just talking earlier, Peter, about, you know, Wilberforce, and you said, well, he was involved in over 200 charities. you are fairly experienced, in the diplomatic world and the UN, and the issue of the environment, which Danny's mentioned, is a hot topic.
Yes.
What's your take on this? And in the context of what we've been discussing.
Well, there are always things that certain powerful people want to produce, and one of those is fear. Now, the current fear is climate change, and we're pouring all this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's creating greenhouse gases, which is causing temperatures to rise, more storms, etc., etc., etc. So there's this big fear package. But when you look at the science and look at the data, it's not backed up by evidence. But certain people want to have this fear factor. And if you're producing a news program or a magazine or a newspaper or internet news site, you have to have a disaster headline. Now, the current one is this huge big storm coming towards the UK out of the Atlantic. There's this enormous big storm coming, and there'll be, 6-story high building waves and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it gives people the jingles, you see. People like that. Oh, the big storm, you see. And you have to have that for our media to function. Now, if people say, there's no problem with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, no one's going to report that. You won't get research funding money to research that because there's no huge big problem that you're solving. If you want to be a climate change scientist and get funding, you have to believe in the orthodoxy of man-induced climate change.
What do you think of that?
Well, this is where I thought it'd be fascinating to engage with the environment issue that we've identified, because yes, you can feel it, can't you? It's changed, the tide has turned. If you do start to say that you are worried that the evidence doesn't seem to substantiate the claims, you're seen as a...
Scientific evidence.
Exactly. You're seen as a denier straight away.
Yes.
It's a very pejorative phrase to use, isn't it? Because it puts you on the wrong side of a line before you can start conversing about the facts. And it's those issues that I think tip detailed discussions, because they're in the background all the time. That's the stuff I get excited about, challenging. So could you... One thing I've been fascinated by is some of the conversations I've heard you have with other people about the idea of overpopulation of the planet. Could you just give us some of the facts on that one as well that people don't often hear, do they?
I wish I had it with me, but it talks about the teeming hordes and wars and pestilence that can be considered a benefit to prune the luxuriance of the human race. Yep. That was recorded by Tertullian in Carthage in the 3rd century AD. So there's always been cities where people have banded together because that's where you have all the facilities, all the political power, all the schools, all the hospitals, everything's happening in these centres. And they're crowded. Ancient Rome, ancient Athens, ancient Carthage were all crowded. London's crowded, Manhattan's crowded, Melbourne and Sydney are crowded. And if you live in those centres, it's crowded. I hate going through London during peak hour. It's a nightmare. You're cheek to jowl with people. They smell badly. Sometimes you might smell badly. It's awful. And people go, oh, there's too many people. I remember the first time I came to the UK, 1979. I'd been taught the world was overpopulated. There were so many people in Britain, there was only just standing room. And we landed at Heathrow, and my brother was working at Peterborough then as a civil engineer. We drove out of London, all of a sudden, there's countryside. I thought, what? There's no one out here. And by the time I got up to the Highlands, it's just sheep up in Scotland.
But it is
there was no people.
Populated if you put in all the gas-guzzling engines, and the pollution. If you've ever driven through Bombay or been, in a rickshaw with a lorry's exhaust going into your nose.
Yeah, but I worked in the automotive industry for 13 years. Yeah. And we had brilliant emission control systems on vehicles. Now, if you want to sit in a tuk-tuk in Sri Lanka that's a 2-stroke, apart from having zero crash protection, the exhaust fumes would kill you. I was in Lagos once at one evening and I thought, there's a fog. I could hardly see through the air. I thought, no, it's not a fog, it's just the carbon dioxide and all the pollutants coming out of all these clapped out vehicles that are on the road. But we know how to make petrol engines that produce almost no nasty emissions.
This is where I was challenged by Al Gore's inconvenient truth, because the hockey stick, as we now know, I mean, if I'd have said even 6 years ago that would be held in disrepute, you were considered to be a denier. But now everyone agrees, even the IPCC have said, no, that's true, that hockey stick was a use of information that was presented in a certain way.
Selective.
Very selective.
It was selective.
So when I've seen that before, and again, I may be obviously wrong here, but you have the experience to sort of engage with this. Is there an agenda? Because sometimes I've learned with things like in schooling here, evolution is you touch it, all of a sudden you realise you've touched something much bigger than the subject. I mean, obviously pro-life issue is a very similar one. Do you think the climate change issue has almost become like an orthodoxy? There's an agenda there?
It's such an orthodoxy, you can't get funding if you're not a carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas, man-induced global warming believer.
Right.
And these people are treated as heretics if they don't go along with that.
Yes, it's that.
So you're only given the funding to do the research if you believe this particular line. Now, I don't know if this is true or not, but I believe Maggie Thatcher popularised this because she wanted nuclear power stations.
Correct.
That's what I believe.
Interestingly, the head of the Met at the time was John Horton, Professor John Horton, Jesus College, Oxford.
Yes.
And the whole conference was hijacked by Maggie Thatcher. She came out with a statement. She was well ahead of her time in terms of PR management of any issue.
And that was a very clever tactic to push for nuclear power stations. See, if we could agree with what we do with the waste, nuclear power stations are very cheap. Very, very cheap. But see, in America, they just put the waste out in the desert in a big storage facility. So it's a very simple system. Whereas here, no one will agree to have the storage system in their backyard. So we've got a dilemma with how we deal with, when we decommission these stations and what we do with the radioactive
Is there a possibility that the lid's being lifted a little bit on the sort of scientific Taliban? That people are now, in the media questioning. I saw a Matt Ridley article a couple of days ago basically saying we can't completely trust the scientists as we thought we once could.
But most countries of the world just ignore it. I was meeting with I won't say which country, but from Southeast Asia. I said, what do you do about reducing carbon dioxide? Nothing, he says. We just ignore Kyoto. That's what they do. China and India ignore it. So these developing countries that are producing massive amounts of carbon dioxide just don't comply.
I was reading somewhere that because of obviously the population in China, to deny them the opportunity to enjoy life as much as we have by bigging up their carbon footprint, it means they're going to be about a third of the use, and they're aiming for that the West has used traditionally. But I'm just struck by the size of the population and the effect. Carbon tax credits and that whole system, that's what's worrying me, is the economic drive. It seems to be almost the main reason for the agenda, so that it's going to lots of money is flowing.
There is an agenda called NSSM 200 written by Kissinger.
Right.
And this was a document produced by the national security people in America. And it said that certain countries are going to have massive population growth and they are going to be competitors to us. And we must target those countries, like Nigeria, that was one of them. Indonesia, we must target these countries to try and limit their population growth so that they will not be competitors with us.
Amazing.
So this is why it does come back to the sort of the pro-life issue and the population of the earth. Yes. There's something happening that these things all come around to make a very strong agenda. Would you say, I mean, with 7 billion, people said, I can remember when I was very young, that 7 billion would be a disaster. And I guess they're talking about 9 billion now being a disaster. I mean, as Christians, obviously, the planet's been made a certain way, even though it's broken compared to what it should have been. It's still got an incredible capacity, hasn't it? Or is that too much hubris?
Well, let's have a look at the last 100 years.
Yeah.
We went from 2 billion in 1900 to 6 billion, just before the turn of the century. So the population trebled. What happened to the overall financial welfare of the world? It increased.
Yes.
What happened to the health outcomes of the world? It increased. Every factor that education outcomes, everything has improved.
Yes.
Everything has improved in those last 100 years. Now, I can remember in high school, 1963, in geography, being taught Australia would run out of iron ore in 20 years' time.
Right.
I remember the lesson well. Now, I want to ask you, do you know where all the iron ore came from to feed China's industrialisation? It came from the Mount Newman mines in Western Australia. I've been there. It's a massive ridge of iron ore, pure hematite.
Amazing.
And they just blow it up and grind it up and pelletise it and ship it across to China. And Australia's economy is booming.
Right.
And you see, when the iron ore is in the ground, it's not worth much. But when you make it into low carbon steel, it's worth something.
Yes.
Your laptop is worth something, but the sand from the beach isn't worth much. But that's what they make the silicon chips out of.
Yeah.
And you see, God has given us the brain power to use this beautiful planet. Amazing resources. There's more than enough for everybody. I believe the reason countries are poor is corruption and war. They are the two biggest killers. I mean, I've been to Nigeria, I've been to Sri Lanka. The corruption is out of this world. Here we have corruption, but it's nowhere near like it is in those countries. No. Most people get a reasonably fair go here. There's a reasonably sized middle class. Yes, you've got the super rich. You don't have that many really poor. You have some, but you'll always have some poor. But Britain led the world with the Industrial Revolution. I have an engineering degree. Britain led the world with the first industrialised nation. Couldn't have done it if they weren't Christian. Believing in a rational universe, rational laws, repeatable experiment. It was a true scientific and industrial revolution.
Yes.
And we're in danger of losing that because the scientific approach is now under threat by the ideologues.
Yes.
I'll give an example. I was at the NGO committee once in New York, and there was an objectionable little NGO called the Australian Lesbian Medical Association. And I asked the Pakistan delegate to ask a question to them. What research have you done on the high rates of venereal disease amongst lesbians? Here they are, medical GPs concerned with lesbian reproductive health. And you'd have thought that man had introduced the bubonic plague into the room. Within moments, one delegate had called his ambassador to call the Pakistan ambassador to get him to pull his head in. It was unbelievable. And one of the delegates said, "We don't want any medical or scientific reports." That's what she said. So because it conflicted with the ideological position.
Right.
It's amazing, isn't it, how politics can actually twist any issue.
This is
destroying science.
And even this environmental issue.
Well, when I watch the pro-life, see, for me, the pro-life context is exactly the same. There's an orthodoxy. If you touch it, you can feel it. It's more than it should be. That's what always makes me think, well, there's something, it's a belief system rather than something that's purely factual. And would you say, I mean, I'm thinking of, there was a big discussion when George W. Bush said he was going to stop UN funding for
abortion.
And is it Jean Head?
I know Jean Head, my great friend at the UN.
Well, I heard she's a bit of a case.
Your name dropping.
That was my fault.
Oh, you knew about it. Yeah.
Her boss, Darla St. Martin, had known President Bush for 20 years before he was elected president. And he used to kiss her on the cheek before he left each reception. Lovely man. And they really knew each other well. And for those 8 years that the Bush administration was in power, the UN pushed nothing pro-abortion because it couldn't. Because the US just said no. And we were there to encourage the US delegates to follow their president's position on all of this. And some followed it a little less enthusiastically than the others. And we were there to assist these people to carry out their president's position.
Be interesting to know what the statistics are of how many he saved
Well,
just during his
millions,
eight
millions.
years.
Millions.
This is what's always impacted me about that.
Yes.
And that's why I think that this is why it's such a powerful conversation with a Wilberforce connection, because he seemed to be able to, with the Clapham group, change the big orthodoxy of the day. We were saying this in the car about the vested interests in the slave. It was an incredible global industry, and to manage to turn that, it seems to me we have similar giants, as it were, in the land today. And this is one of them, that the climate change, the population fear, it buys into statements without verification, like, you know, it's responsible not to have
and you can
many
be
children.
persuaded, because you know, acid rain and such like does make people think, well, you know, man-made pollution from factories. I saw it in Eastern Europe actually after the communist era. You know, whole forest decimated. So there is something to be said for responsible industrial development.
Absolutely.
But if they take it too far, then of course the fanatics come in.
I've always been struck by that
debate
in Genesis. I mean, it's Prince Charles that, it must have been in the late 70s, he said he didn't like the Christian beginning, Genesis, because it used the word subdue the earth. And as you know, his dad and his WWF and all that stuff, he put himself outside the Christian understanding of that word subdue, because it does sound like it's a license to punish the planet. But in fact, it means the planet's been made to be able to be
We are to reign over it. We are the kings and queens over creation. I grew up on a farm. I remember my father planting this big orchard when I was 5 years of age, and he said, "Peter, this is your orchard." Wonderful. He planted these radiata pine trees down one side of the orchard as a windbreak. My brother now cuts them up for timber. He did things to provide for the next generation.
Reminds me of
he
Naboth.
cared for the land. Yes, that's what they did. And you see, people don't value people because they look at poor people. See, if you go to really poor countries and you see huge numbers of poor people, you think, oh, these people are poor because they've got so many children. But these people have lots of children because that's their social services. There's no social services. When you get old, they need their children to care for them when they can't work anymore. And to impose our developed welfare state system on these countries is criminal. But that's what's being done.
And that's what's in my mind when it comes to this obviously very popular debate as we go into 2015 about immigration into this country. You were saying that the figures of yearly abortion and net immigration are quite
virtually the same.
And that's fascinating, because again it's going to that bigger issue of the value of human life itself. And it has all these sort of ramifications. If we could find a tipping point.
Well, you see, there's talk about the ageing population.
Yes.
You get this graying, at the UN too, the greying of the population, the number of carers that will be needed in the next 10 years, etc.
NHS burden.
And they do this, all that, and they do this at the UN too, but they never mention, maybe we haven't had enough babies. It's never mentioned. So again, you've got people who are blinded. They're blinded by individual human rights. The individual is the centre of his universe, and that's all he's really caring about. And this is the human rights approach at the UN. I remember a British delegate saying to me this one day, "Oh, we're concerned with individual human rights," which means anyone can claim anything's a human right, and they should get it.
That's what's happening.
Which is a disaster.
So it's not a corporate thing. Humanity as a whole is not thinking like that.
Just the individual.
Just about me.
It's the individual. And the Lord said, "Love the Lord your God and your neighbour as yourself." And once you forget loving your neighbour, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. But that's where the UN is at the moment. They're wanting to push this social engineering thing on the world. They want to say to them, "Oh, you have too many people. If you have less people, you'll develop." How's that going to happen? It's never going to happen.
Well, certainly in terms of countries, you have to have a significant critical mass of population to have a workable internal
Where I grew
economy.
up, we had no bitumen roads. We couldn't afford them. There weren't enough people on the little island I grew up on. We didn't have a flush toilet until I was 8. We didn't have town water. We collected the water off the roof of the farmhouse. Didn't have enough people. You need a certain amount of people to get things. Now, London has all these facilities. Of course, there's so many people there, they can afford it. Up in Prestwick, where I live, we don't have as much because it's only small, 15,000 people. You can't afford to have everything.
Well, there's the ramification again of individualism.
We're in the last minute.
Yeah, I just thought I'd finish it on that idea that the family, the idea that one of the man and the woman, one could be full-time looking after the children, because the next generation surely is the most important job of all.
Yes.
And something's happened again.
It's been denigrated.
It has been denigrated, and we're seeing it in policy. So I'm hoping that this big idea chat leads to practical consideration of detailed policy.
Brilliant.
And more of that in the future, I hope, if we get the chance to do it.
We needed someone from the outback of Australia
to
teach
come
us about population control.
Absolutely.
Need more.
Thank you very much, and loved the story of your father with the orchard, because I think that chimes with us preserving our spiritual heritage for the next generation.
Absolutely.
And we're in our last few seconds, so thank you very much, you, for viewing this fascinating programme. For Danny Stupple and for Peter Smith.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And all we can say is that we will not sell our inheritance along with a Naboth. We have quite a job to do in these days.
Indeed we do.
It's a great privilege.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll have to go on to the other subjects another time.
Indeed.